This thing covers 2 football fields in under 5 seconds from a standing start. How does it do it? Well, you're about to find out. So this car's really special to us here at Haltech. It's one of the first R5 test cars. It's an early 70s series Ford Cortina. It's got the Ford small block engine, twin turbocharged of course. It's got an automatic transmission. It's got the radial tyres on the back. And in today's episode of Anatomy of a Drag Car, we're going to be going through this particular car, looking at the sensors it's got and the ECU functions it's using to get this 8-mile radial drag racer down the strip, as opposed to how you'd use those functions in a conventional street car. Well, the first thing you need to go drag racing is bulk horsepower. That's what this thing's got. So in here, this is a 396 cubic inch or about 6.5 litre Ford small block Windsor. It's been prepared by BK race engines, and of course, it's got 2 ginormous 88mm Garrett turbochargers hanging off the front. Feeding the methanol fuel into this engine is a Waterman mechanical fuel pump that's belt driven off the crankshaft. It pressurizes the fuel, brings it up, puts it into the dual fuel rail setup. So this thing in the primary fuel rail has got a Siemens Decker 2200cc injector per cylinder. The secondary fuel rail has got a Plasma Man 5400cc injector per cylinder. So put that in perspective, a huge horsepower street car might have a 2000cc injector. That makes really good power. This thing's got nearly 8000cc of methanol per cylinder. That's why it can make upwards of sort of 2,200 horsepower, and how these 88mm Garrett turbos can pump nearly 40 pounds of boost pressure into this animal. One thing you might notice here is there's a couple of extra injectors in the intake charge pipe here. So like I said before, this thing's got 16 injectors that are operated sequentially. That means that the ECU's got 16 injector drivers that are controlling these 16 injectors. But the R5 was designed with these style of cars in mind, and the way that these cars are going now, these turbochargers are feeding straight into the inlet manifold. There's no intercooler, there's no water to air intercooler, it's nothing. This boosted hot air straight into the engine. So the way that the guys have been cooling that air charge is by spraying methanol straight into the intake pipe. Now, that fuel coming through technically is being used by the engine, and that would be getting distributed by the intake manifold, and it is getting modelled in our fuel modelling or our volumetric efficiency fuel modelling in the ECU. But more importantly, as that fuel changes from the high pressure into the low pressure, there's a phase change there which results in a cooling of that fuel as it comes out the tip of the nozzle. It cools the intake charge, in turn making that charge more dense, then the engine makes more power. And we're seeing that in the mile an hour, in the times and in the mile an hour these cars run over the 1/8 and over quarters. So it's not so much of a myth like people used to think. When we do this, the cars do run faster, meaning they do pick up power. With all those fuel injectors and that mechanical fuel pump pushing fuel up through, we've got an aeromotive fuel pressure regulator that keeps that all in check. So no matter what the pump RPM, no matter what the fueling demand, that aeromotive fuel pressure regulator's job there is to keep the differential fuel pressure, the pressure across the injector, consistent across all operating ranges. That way we can get the best tune into the thing. Moving down the back, we've got the trusty IGN 1A coils. These things pack a huge punch. They're driven directly off the ECU, so we don't have an external ignition module or anything like that to control them, just ECU to that coil to the cylinder, and they'll support a huge horsepower, upwards of thousands of horsepower on a V8 engine. Over the side here, we've got a clear view filtration system. This thing's really cool. So the engine oil comes out of the oil pump through this thing, and you can actually see parts of your engine in there when it starts failing, so you can look in there and figure out how much that pass just cost you. Some little interesting things on the front of this car, not the turbochargers, the oil feed to the turbochargers. It's got a little speed flow filter here, nice little thing so that it filters that oil before it goes into your Garrett turbochargers, making sure that they last a very long time. On the outlet or the exhaust pipes from the turbochargers, there's these funny little X's and little dots here. What they are, that's actually a cross that's welded inside that pipe so that if the worst does happen and you lose an exhaust turbine wheel, it doesn't fly out and into the crowd through the front exhaust here. All it does is it just sits against that X, spins, makes a lot of noise, and you know that you need to replace that turbocharger. But you can make all the power in the world, and that's not going to make your car fast. In order to get your thousands of horsepower from the start to the end, you need power management. And for that, let's go inside and figure out how we get this car to go. So I'm in the office chair here, and first I thought I'd try and explain what a drag car is. Like, everyone gets it, but the whole purpose of this drag car is to accelerate from a standing start to a position 1/8 of a mile or 1/4 mile away as quickly and as fast as possible, meaning that we get a top speed and we do it in the shortest amount of time possible. So it's easy to say, oh, my engine makes 2,240 horsepower. Well, when you're sitting here, it's easy to say that because that's what it makes. But it's another thing to use that horsepower to accelerate this mass from a standstill, which is the hard part, to another position as quick as possible. And to do that, we need to manage that power. This particular car, it's doing it incredibly well. This thing, it runs, I think its PB is 442 at 165 mile an hour as the 8th. Since the R5's gone into this car, it's actually PB'd 2 or 3 times already, and he wants more. He wants this thing to go faster, so he will keep on developing this package to go as quick as he can in this Cortina. The challenges with getting your drag car to accelerate as fast as possible and get the best times possible, there's 2 big challenges. The first challenge is to get the engine to make enough horsepower to initially accelerate from 0 kilometers an hour to anything as consistently and as fast as possible. Then the second challenge is, once the car's actually moving, in order to manage that power and ramp that power in over time as the tyre can handle that horsepower. And to do that, we use our boost control strategy, we use our target driveshaft RPM strategy, and we use our trans brake and bump function. The first thing you need for drag racing is an Owls Race Glide automatic transmission. This thing's got a turbo 400 in it with a trans brake. Now, what a trans brake system does, when I engage this button here, the gearbox engages the first gear and reverse gear at the same time. So wrap your head around that. So say if you're in your manual transmission and just by chance you somehow selected first and reverse at the same time, you would press the throttle and the gearbox would be locked behind that engine, meaning that the only thing that can slip is the torque converter. Or in my example, it would be the clutch would slip. Obviously, that's not a thing that you do. In this particular setup, what would happen then is that you would hold that trans brake. First and reverse are engaged. You put your foot down. We're still on the trans brake. The RPM will come up and it'll flare through the torque converter. Then it'll hit a soft rev limit or our launch rev limit. It'll build boost against that torque converter. Then I'll get up close, so that'll be in pre-stage or when I've got the first light on the drag racing Christmas tree. I'll then press this bump button. And what the bump button does, the engine management system then releases the reverse gear off, and actually allows the car to bump forward in order to get both lights on the Christmas tree. So there's a lot of mind games in this part of it in drag racing, where when you've got 2 cars that come up to race against each other, there's Some people like to go in first, meaning get set up ready to race first. Some people like to wait until their opponent goes in. Some people will change their strategies depending on whether it's a qualifier or semi-finals or into the finals. There's a lot of magic in how all of that works, where there's things like some people might not want to go into that full stage situation and be perfectly ready to race because their opponent might hold them out, it's called. And what that means is that you come up, you're ready to race, you've got huge power, you're cooking that automatic transmission because you've got first gear and reverse gear locked so that everything's overheating. Your opponent can just sit there for a certain amount of time waiting until you're nice and hot, then they'll come in, then they'll take off. The reason why we have this bumping strategy is that we can come in and get our first light sitting on that tree, then we can sit for as long as we want. The opponent has to come in also to that first light, then the skill is in controlling your braking system or your trans brake system in order to be able to accurately and repeatedly get this car to bump into full stage. And to do that, when we press this button, the engine management system controls the gearing system, and that's programmed through the engine management system. So every time we press that button, the car will move forward a certain distance, and the driver's in tune with that. They know exactly how far to bump in order to set up against their opposition. Then as soon as their opposition does whatever they've decided to do, go into full stage, so turn both lights on, you can then bump in as well. The owner of this car tells us that the way that we've got this car configured is super, super repeatable and accurate and bumps in a very small amount at a time, which is the way that he likes it to be done. And it's because of that this car's been so successful lately. One of the secrets in being able to get the trans brake solenoid and the bump feature to work so well is the ability to map the duty cycle, or how much we pulse that solenoid, versus the gearbox oil temperature and the launch RPM. So as we change the launch RPM, the engine's obviously making more or less power. And that means that every time we press that button, the car would bump further forward. If we had more power, it would bump not as far if we had less power. So when we move our launch RPM, the duty cycles that we configure for the trans brake solenoid are also mapped against that same RPM launch strategy. So that's how we get this nice and accurate. The next part of the system is managing the power once we actually get the car to take off. Once we release this button, that's the start of our drag race. So that will trigger the start of our race timer. So I'll release this button, a timer in the engine management system starts counting, and that's what we can map all of our engine power delivery functions against. That race timer is the main table axis for our target drive shaft RPM curve. This is a really important thing of drag racing. So we've got a drive shaft speed sensor. It's on the tail shaft. It's normally got 8 magnets that has got a sensor detecting those magnets. So every time a tooth goes past, we know exactly how fast the drive shaft is going. We've then got a map set up in the software that is our race time versus our target drive shaft RPM. All of the good tuners would have a really nice sort of idea of the weight of the car, the tyre that the car's got, the type of power adder the engine's got, so whether it's a supercharged, a turbocharged, or a nitrous powered car. They know what sort of drive shaft curve to expect out of the car, so you can put that target in and then make adjustments to the engine power depending on that curve. If you're going over that drive shaft curve, meaning that the wheels are spinning way faster than you would have expected, we can drop boost pressure out of the engine, we could retard the ignition timing, or we could actually do individual cylinder cuts to drop whole cylinder events in order to limit the power. Likewise, if you're under that drive shaft curve, then the tuner knows that the car can accept more drive shaft RPM. We can actually feed more boost pressure in or more ignition timing into the car, overriding any of the torque management retard ignition corrections. This way, you're not so much always limiting power with the torque management, you can also add engine power in order to get to that desired drive shaft curve. But that's not all the race time is doing in this car. The target boost control is also mapped against the race timer. So that means that when we're at 0 race time, the boost controller is targeting our launch pressure. Then as we go down the track and the car can accept more boost pressure, say at 1 second into the run, we might target, say, 15 or 20 pounds of boost pressure. At 2 seconds into the run, we might target 25. At 3 seconds into the run, 35, 40, 50 pounds, whatever the tyre will take. By then, we'll be going fast enough that we can feed in all of the power and try and get the thing to go as fast as we can. In order to have really good control over the boost pressure, this car uses a CO2 bottle. So that CO2 bottle, it's normally got, say, maybe 120 or 150 PSI of pressure in it. It then goes through a regulator, bringing that down to a consistent pressure of around 100 PSI. That pressure goes up to the front, through the boost control solenoids, and that goes to the top of the wastegate, the hat. The wastegate hat has got a pressure sensor in it, which is connected to the engine management system. We can then target a wastegate hat pressure, resulting in an inlet boost pressure. We do this for a couple of reasons. One, it makes super consistent boost control. So using CO2, it makes everything really, really smooth and really nice and really easy and repeatable. The second reason why we use CO2 boost control is because in an engine like this, we want to use a really wide varying range of boost levels. So for example, we might want to launch this car with say 3, 4, 5 pounds of boost pressure, but then 2 or 3 seconds into the run, we might want 40 pounds of boost pressure. And if we had a Pro Mod V8, we might want 80 pounds of boost pressure 3 or 4 seconds into the run. Using a conventional wastegate method, using manifold pressure to control it, it's extremely complicated, if not impossible, to achieve those boost pressures without some type of external pressure source. Enter CO2 boost control. So when we've got that regulated 100-pound force going into those wastegates, we can regulate the pressure on the top of the hat, resulting in a huge range of intake manifold pressures, and that allows us to manage the power across the racetrack. But the CO2 is not just being used for the boost control in this car. It's also being used to shift the automatic transmission from first to second gear. And the way that that works, we've got that same regulated air pressure comes up to our shift solenoid in the transmission. Once the ECU detects that we've got over a certain throttle position, over a certain race time, and over a certain engine RPM, we've also got safeties in there as well, so that it's not going to shift on a wheel spin or anything like that, or when you don't expect it. What'll happen once we're there, sorry about the noise, we'll be in first gear, flat out coming down. Instead of me leaning over and manually shifting that gear up, that air ram is going to come out and do it for us, and it would just look like this. That would have shifted from first to second gear. We hold on for dear life till we get to the end. Then we slam on the brakes, we pull the parachute, but this car is about to change as well. So where we pull the parachute, we're actually not going to be pulling the parachute in the near future. It's actually going to be powered by that same CO2 as well. Should the worst happen, the electromotion safety device would trigger the parachute out the back and it'd shut the engine down so that the thing will slow down by itself and hopefully the driver will be able to control it and pull it to the side of the track. Now that's the theory of it all. And while I can't take this out and do an 1/8 mile or 1/4 mile pass, I can bump it in the workshop here to sort of show you a bit about how it sounds and what to expect when a car bumps forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to pump up the line lock so the front brakes are locked in position. So that's going to help us to stay in one spot. I'm then going to bring the revs up. I'm going to hold the trans brake on. That means it's going to engage first gear and reverse gear at the same time. I'm going to start applying throttle until our RPM comes up and up and up and up until we hit our launch RPM, where you'll hear it start misfiring and bouncing off sort of like a rev limiter. Then I'm going to press the bump button and we're going to clunk forward, forward, forward. Then I'm going to come, I could release the trans brake and would take off in a drag race, but in the workshop I'm not doing that. I'll release the throttle and we'll come back to idle. I hope the neighbours aren't going to be too upset with that noise. As always, thanks very much for watching. My name's Scott, and I'll catch you next time.